The nights in my neighborhood always felt peaceful, the kind that lull you into a false sense of security. Our street was lined with tall maples whose leaves whispered softly in the wind, and the old lampposts cast pale circles of light on the cracked pavement. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, and neighbors waved hello more often than not. But something about those late hours, the ones after midnight, had always unsettled me, like the quiet was too perfect, waiting to be broken. I remember one particular evening when that uneasy feeling crept in stronger than usual. It was a Tuesday, though the weekday didn't really matter at that hour. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the old clock in the living room. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to fall asleep. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, but that was nothing new. What caught my attention first was a faint scraping noise, almost like nails on wood, coming from somewhere near the back porch. I froze, listening intently, hoping it was just some stray animal. But the sound persisted, slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the house to the other. At first, I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a squirrel rummaging through the garbage cans. We had seen plenty of raccoons in the area before, and they were noisy little critters. Yet this noise didn't sound like a scurry or a rustle. It was more precise, like something or someone was trying to get my attention. I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake my parents who were in the next room. The house felt colder than usual, and when I reached the window by my bed, I peered out into the dark yard. The moon was a thin crescent, barely enough to illuminate the yard. The shadows of the trees stretched long and deep, making the yard look like a patchwork of black and gray. I didn't see anything at first, just the empty swing swaying gently in the breeze. Then I heard it again, the scraping sound, this time closer to the front porch. Goosebumps prickled my skin. I could hear a faint whispering now, like someone speaking just beyond the edge of hearing. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. My heart pounded in my chest as I debated whether to call out or stay hidden. I chose to stay silent, afraid that noise would only encourage whoever, or whatever, it was. I tiptoed down the hall and reached for the front door's peephole. Pressing my eye to it, I scanned the street. The lamp post flickered, casting a weak glow over the cracked sidewalk and empty road. The low hum of distant traffic was the only sound I could hear. No sign of movement. That's when I noticed the faintest flicker of shadow near the edge of the driveway, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. It was quick, almost like a blink, there, then gone. My breath caught, and I pulled back from the door. Was I imagining it? Or was something really out there? The whispering had stopped, replaced by a soft scratching noise, like fingertips dragging across rough wood. It wasn't coming from one spot but seemed to circle the house, moving steadily, as if something was tracing the perimeter. I backed away slowly, my eyes wide, ears straining for any clue. Back in my room, I grabbed my phone, debating whether to call someone. My fingers trembled as I texted my best friend, hoping for a quick response. Weird noises outside. I'm kinda scared. The reply came almost immediately, probably just the wind. Don't freak out. I wanted to believe that, but the atmosphere in the house was shifting, growing heavier, darker. The streetlights outside flickered again, and I caught a glimpse of movement in the living room window, something pale, moving just beyond the glass. I blinked hard, but it was gone. Unable to stay still, I crept toward the front door, careful to keep out of sight from any windows. Peering through the glass, I saw nothing but the empty street. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted footprints on the porch, wet, muddy prints that hadn't been there before. They were small, like a child's, but the way they curved around the steps suggested someone had been pacing, watching, waiting. Fear clawed at my throat. These prints weren't mine or my family's, and I was sure no one else lived nearby who would wander in the middle of the night. I wanted to grab a flashlight, but my hands were shaking too much. Instead, I stood frozen, listening as the scratching noise began again, louder this time, coming from the back door. I swallowed hard and edged toward the kitchen window, pulling back the curtain just enough to look outside. The backyard was a black void broken only by the faint glow of the moon. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was tall and thin, standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. I could barely make out its shape, but the way it moved was deliberate, slow, almost mechanical. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back from the window. The whispering returned, louder now, but still impossible to understand. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the figure or some other source. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The scratching stopped, and the night fell silent again, as if nothing had happened. The only evidence left was the muddy footprints on the porch and the lingering chill that refused to fade. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight by my side, too afraid to close my eyes. When dawn finally broke, the sun's warm light chased away the shadows, and the house felt normal again. But I knew that something had been out there, something watching and waiting in the night. Over the following days, I checked the yard and porch repeatedly, but the footprints were gone, as if they had never been there. No neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual, and my parents dismissed it as my imagination running wild. But I knew the truth, the quiet of the night was a mask, hiding things that only revealed themselves when the world was asleep. Since that night, I found myself more aware of the sounds that came after midnight, the rustling leaves, the creaking branches, the distant howls of coyotes. Each noise carried a weight I couldn't explain, a reminder that the peace of the neighborhood was fragile, and sometimes, the darkness held secrets better left undisturbed. Months after that unnerving night in the quiet neighborhood, I found myself in a completely different setting, my first semester at college, living alone in a small city apartment. It was a world away from the calm streets I grew up on, filled instead with the constant hum of traffic, neon signs flickering through my blinds, and neighbors whose doors were always slammed shut by midnight. The city had its own kind of energy, restless and unpredictable, but I thought I was ready for it. One night, after a long day of classes and studying, I settled into my cramped living room with a textbook and a cup of tea. The apartment was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. It was close to midnight, the hour when the city's noise quieted just enough to make the silence feel heavier. I was half listening to some music when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. At first, I thought it was a message from a friend, but the screen showed an unknown number. The first text was simple, "Are you there?" I frowned, not recognizing the number, but I replied cautiously, "Who is this?" No answer came for a few minutes. Then the phone buzzed again, "Watching you." A chill ran down my spine. I stared at the screen, heart racing. Was this some kind of prank? I was alone, no one else had access to my apartment, and I hadn't shared my number with anyone outside my circle. I considered ignoring the message, but curiosity, and a growing sense of unease, got the better of me. "What do you mean?" I typed back, fingers trembling. The reply came instantly, "By the window. I see you." I froze, the words echoing in my mind. My apartment had only 2 windows, one in the bedroom and another in the living room facing the street. I glanced toward the living room window, the streetlight outside barely illuminating the cracked pavement below. Nothing seemed out of place. I told myself it was a sick joke, maybe some classmate trying to scare me. But then my phone buzzed again, "Don't turn around." Panic bubbled up. My breath quickened, and I slowly turned away from the window to scan the room. The small apartment was empty except for me and the shadows cast by the flickering lamp. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement or an intruder, but nothing was there. Trying to steady my nerves, I grabbed my phone and dialed campus security. The line rang, and after a few moments, a calm voice answered. I explained the messages and my fear, and they promised to send a patrol by my building. While waiting, I kept my back to the wall, eyes glued to every corner of the room. Minutes later, my phone buzzed again, "They won't help you." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Who was this person? How did they know I had called for help? And most terrifying of all, how were they inside my life, invading my sanctuary? The security guard arrived just as the messages stopped. He checked the doors and windows, found no signs of forced entry, and reassured me that nothing seemed amiss. I wanted to believe him, but the dread lingered like a shadow clinging to my skin. Over the next few nights, the texts resumed, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes just after I returned from class. The messages grew more detailed and personal. "I see you at the library, you took the bus home tonight, your roommate isn't really your friend." Each message was like a cold breath on my neck, a reminder that someone was watching, following my every move. I tried changing my phone number, but the messages found me again, always from a new number, always from the unknown. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, checking over my shoulder constantly, locking every door and window multiple times. Friends suggested it might be a hacker or a stalker, but the anonymity of the texts made it impossible to trace. The police were sympathetic but limited in what they could do without physical evidence or a suspect. One night, the messages took a darker turn. "You can't hide forever," it said. "I'm closer than you think." That was the moment fear truly took hold. I stopped going out alone, avoided late-night study sessions, and slept with the lights on. But no matter what precautions I took, the messages never stopped. Sometimes, I caught the faintest sound outside my window, a scraping or a soft whisper, so quiet I wasn't sure if it was real or my imagination. One evening, I decided to confront the fear head-on. I set up my phone to record video and audio, hoping to catch whoever was behind the messages or lurking nearby. I left every window and door locked but cracked the blinds open just enough to see the street below. Hours passed with nothing but the usual city noises, distant sirens, the hum of cars, footsteps echoing on the pavement. Then, just past midnight, my phone buzzed. I looked down at the screen. I'm outside. The blood drained from my face. I grabbed my phone and switched on the flashlight app, aiming it toward the front door. The beam illuminated the empty hallway of the apartment building, no one in sight. But then I heard it, a faint scratching at the door, like nails dragging slowly across the wood. I backed away, heart pounding, and called the police again. This time, they arrived within minutes and searched the building's entrance and surrounding area. No one was found. The incident was reported, but without more proof, the threat remained intangible. The messages stopped for a few days, then resumed, less frequent but no less chilling. Living under this invisible threat changed me. I went from confident and carefree to constantly anxious, always expecting the unknown to step through my door. The city that once felt exhilarating became claustrophobic and hostile. My apartment, no longer a refuge, was a cage built from fear. Despite all this, I kept trying to hold on to normalcy, attending classes, meeting friends, studying late with others nearby. But the shadow of the unknown watcher lingered, a silent presence that refused to be shaken. One night, as I sat studying in the dim glow of my desk lamp, my phone buzzed again. The message was simple: "You're not alone." And in that moment, I knew the nightmare was far from over. The tension I'd been carrying for weeks finally reached a breaking point one night when the messages took a terrifying turn. It was well past midnight, and I was sitting at my desk, trying to focus on a paper due the next day. The apartment was cloaked in darkness except for the glow of my laptop screen. I'd convinced myself to ignore the texts, but my phone buzzed again. This time, the message wasn't just words, it was something else entirely. "You're not alone," it read. I stared at the screen, heart pounding harder than ever. The words echoed in my mind, but what chilled me most was what came next. I felt a sudden chill in the room, like a cold breath brushing past my neck. I spun around slowly, eyes scanning the shadows. At first, there was nothing, just the familiar shapes of my furniture and the dark corners that the lamp didn't reach. Then, just beyond the doorway to the hallway, I saw it, a flicker of movement, a shadow shifting against the wall. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my phone and switched on the flashlight, aiming the beam toward the figure. But it vanished instantly, like smoke dissipating in the wind. I blinked, heart hammering, trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined it. That's when the scratching started. It was soft at first, like fingernails tracing the wood of the floor. Then it grew louder, moving closer, circling the room in an impossible pattern. I followed the sound, flashlight trembling in my hand, until it stopped abruptly near the window. I forced myself to look outside. The street was empty, bathed in the weak glow of a flickering street lamp. Nothing stirred, no sign of life. But just as I turned back inside, my eyes caught something on the windowsill, a small, old doll, its porcelain face cracked and stained with what looked like dried blood. I recoiled instinctively, heart pounding. The doll was out of place, a sinister artifact left deliberately for me to find. I didn't know where it had come from, but the message was clear: whoever, or whatever, had been watching was no longer content with just words. I called the police immediately, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. When they arrived, they took the doll as evidence and scoured the apartment for any signs of forced entry or other clues. They found none. No fingerprints, no footprints, nothing. But the doll stayed with me, a constant reminder that the line between observer and participant had blurred. The feeling that I was being watched intensified, and I began to notice more subtle signs, the faintest whispers through the walls, the shadows that appeared just at the corner of my vision, the sense of cold that seemed to follow me from room to room. One night, when I thought I was alone, I heard the whispering again. It was soft, unintelligible at first, but then the words became clearer, chilling in their simplicity. You cannot hide. I wanted to flee, to escape this nightmare, but I was trapped in my own home. The apartment that was supposed to be a sanctuary had become a cage. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoia. I stopped answering the phone, unplugged my internet, and avoided all contact with the outside world. The text ceased for a time, but the presence never left. Then came the footprints. One morning, I woke to find muddy prints on the porch outside my apartment door. They were small, like a child's, and fresh. I hadn't heard anyone come or go. The footprints traced a path circling the entrance, as if someone had been pacing, waiting for me. I called the police again. They took the prints as evidence but warned me to be cautious. No one was caught, and no explanation was found. The doll, the messages, the footprints, it all pointed to the same terrifying truth: I was not alone, and whatever was stalking me was close, watching from the shadows. One night, fueled by a desperate need for answers, I decided to investigate the source of the whispering. Armed with my phone's flashlight and a recording app, I scanned every inch of the apartment, following the faint sounds that seemed to move with me. In the living room, near the window, I found a small crack in the wall, hidden behind the curtains. It was barely noticeable, but the whispering was loudest there. I pressed my ear to the crack and heard it again, a voice, low and ragged, repeating the same words over and over: you cannot hide. Suddenly, the crack widened, revealing a narrow hollow space inside the wall. I reached in and pulled out a small, blood-stained doll identical to the one left on my windowsill. My hands shook as I held it. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening. I felt eyes on me, a presence just beyond the edge of sight. I realized then that the nightmare was far from over. The watcher wasn't just outside the walls, it was inside, hidden in the darkness, waiting. And I was running out of time. After everything I'd been through in the city apartment, the messages, the whispers, the doll in the wall, I needed a change of scenery, something to clear my head. That's how I ended up visiting my cousin Matt and his wife Sarah, who lived in a rural area several hours away. They'd invited me for a weekend getaway, promising fresh air and quiet roads far from the chaos I'd been living through. It was late afternoon when I arrived at their house, a cozy farmhouse nestled between rolling fields and thick woods. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the gravel driveway. Matt greeted me with a firm hug, and Sarah welcomed me inside with a warm smile, their presence a balm for my frayed nerves. That night, after a home-cooked dinner, Matt suggested a drive through the countryside. He said the stars were spectacular this time of year, and the fresh air might do me some good. I was hesitant at first. After all, I'd been living in a state of heightened alertness for weeks, but I agreed, eager for a distraction. We piled into Matt's old pickup truck and headed down a narrow, winding road that cut through the fields. The headlights illuminated the tall grass swaying in the breeze, and the only sounds were the engine's hum and the chirping of crickets. As we drove deeper into the rural stretch, the road grew darker, the trees closing in on both sides. Suddenly, Matt slowed down and pointed to the shoulder up ahead. "Look," he said. There, standing by the edge of the road, was a man. He was tall and thin, wearing a worn jacket and jeans, with a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked out of place in the quiet countryside, like he belonged somewhere else entirely. Matt hesitated but then pulled over. "You want a ride?" he called out. The man didn't reply at first, just stared at us. Then he nodded slowly and climbed into the back seat without saying a word. The ride was tense. The man said nothing, just stared straight ahead. His presence felt off, like a shadow that didn't belong. Sarah tried to make small talk, but he gave only monosyllabic answers. After a few minutes, Matt glanced in the rearview mirror and frowned. "Where are you headed?" he asked. The man's voice was low and rough. "Just passing through." That vague answer didn't sit right with me. Something about him felt wrong, like he was hiding something. As we continued down the road, the atmosphere grew heavier, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Then, out of nowhere, the man spoke again, his voice chillingly calm. "You shouldn't have stopped." Matt's grip tightened on the steering wheel. What do you mean? The man leaned forward slightly, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of his face beneath the cap, pale skin, dark eyes that seemed to glint unnaturally in the dim light. I don't belong here, he said softly. And neither do you. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Something about his words, the way he said them, sent a wave of dread crashing over me. Suddenly, the truck's engine sputtered and died, leaving us stranded in the middle of nowhere. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness except for the faint glow of the moon. Matt tried to start the truck again, but it was no use. The man in the back seat smiled, a slow, unsettling grin, and whispered, "It's too late." Fear gripped me as I realized we were at the mercy of this stranger, whose presence had turned a simple drive into a nightmare. We sat frozen, the silence broken only by the man's soft breathing. Then, without warning, he opened the door and stepped out into the night. His figure disappeared into the shadows between the trees, leaving us alone in the dark. Minutes later, the engine roared back to life as if nothing had happened. Matt wasted no time turning the truck around, speeding back toward the safety of the farmhouse. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than a random hitchhiker. The man's words and actions hinted at something sinister lurking beneath the surface of that quiet rural road. Back at the house, Sarah locked all the doors and windows, her hands trembling slightly. We sat together in the living room, the uneasy silence pressing in on us. That night, as I lay in the guest room listening to the wind outside, I thought about how the calm of the countryside had been shattered by a single presence, how a simple act of kindness, offering a ride, had almost turned into a terrifying ordeal. It made me realize that danger doesn't always announce itself with loud noises or obvious threats. Sometimes, it hides in plain sight, in the quiet moments and the shadowed spaces we think are safe. And sometimes, the people we encounter on the road are not who they seem to be. It was late autumn when I found myself driving down a winding country road with my partner, Jamie. The sun had long set, and the only illumination came from the truck's headlights cutting through the thick blackness. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of wood smoke, and the quiet around us felt almost too complete, like the world had paused to hold its breath. We were returning from a weekend visit to friends, tired but content, the kind of late-night drive that usually felt peaceful. But tonight, something felt off. The road was narrow and lined with dense forest on both sides, shadows pooling beneath the towering trees. Every so often, we'd see a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods, but when we looked closer, it was gone. About 20 miles from town, we spotted him, a man standing alone by the side of the road, his thumb out in the dim light. He wore a dark coat that blended into the night and a hat pulled low over his face. Jamie hesitated, but I slowed down and pulled over. There was something about the man that didn't quite fit with the sleepy rural surroundings, a sense of unease that made my skin prickle. "Need a ride?" I called through the open window. He nodded silently and climbed into the passenger seat without a word. The truck felt colder as soon as he got in, the air thickening. I glanced over, trying to see his face, but the brim of his hat shadowed his features. He didn't speak, just stared straight ahead. The silence between us stretched, growing heavier with every mile. Jamie tried to break it with small talk about the weather and the drive, but the man's responses were curt and monosyllabic. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd picked up someone who didn't belong here, someone who was carrying something dark and dangerous beneath the surface. Then, as we rounded a bend, the man leaned slightly toward me and said in a voice so low it was barely audible, "You shouldn't have stopped." My heart skipped a beat. Jamie shot me a nervous glance, and I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "What do you mean?" I asked, voice steady despite the growing dread. The man's eyes flicked toward me briefly, and I caught a glimpse, pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, eyes that seemed to glint unnaturally in the dim light. "This road isn't safe," he whispered. "Not at night. Not for you." Before I could respond, the truck's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered, then went dark, plunging us into a suffocating blackness. Jamie's breath hitched, and I fumbled to restart the engine, my fingers trembling. The man let out a soft chuckle, a sound that echoed oddly in the cramped space. "You can't escape," he said. "Not here." Panic surged through me. The truck sat motionless, the only sounds the rustling of leaves outside and the rapid beating of my heart. I glanced at Jamie, whose face was pale and tight with fear. Suddenly, the man opened the door and stepped out into the night. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving us alone in the darkness. The silence was broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the whisper of wind through the trees. Then, almost imperceptibly, the engine roared back to life. I wasted no time turning the truck around, speeding back the way we came, the headlights slicing through the night like a beacon of hope. Jamie reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. When we finally pulled into Matt and Sarah's driveway, the safety of the house felt surreal. Sarah greeted us with concern, locking the doors behind us as if to ward off some invisible threat. Later that night, I lay awake in the guest room, replaying the events over and over. The man's words echoed in my mind, chilling and cryptic. Who was he? Why had he targeted us? And what had he meant when he said, "You shouldn't have stopped"? I thought about how easily danger had crept into that quiet stretch of road, how a simple act of kindness, offering a ride, had almost cost us dearly. It was a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes, the scariest encounters happen when we least expect them. As sleep finally claimed me, I carried the unsettling truth with me: the night holds secrets, shadows that move just beyond our sight, and strangers who may not be what they seem. The world is full of hidden dangers, and sometimes, the only thing standing between safety and terror is a moment's hesitation.